It was the 11th of July, 2015. Inside the high-security Altiplano prison in central Mexico, a man known as one of the most dangerous figures on earth stepped into his cell's shower. The cameras that watched him 24 hours a day lost sight of him for just a few seconds. Then he was gone. Guards rushed in, but the cell was empty. Beneath the shower floor, they found a hole, a perfect rectangle cut through concrete. A tunnel stretched for a mile underground, complete with lighting, air ducts, and a rail-mounted motorcycle used to carry him to freedom. The world's most powerful drug lord had vanished again. His name was Joaquín Archibaldo Guzmán Loera, known to the world as El Chapo. For decades, he ruled an empire built on blood, corruption, and ingenuity. But his story didn't begin with power. It began in the mountains of Sinaloa, with nothing but dirt, hunger, and ambition. El Chapo was born on April 4th, 1957, in a small village called La Tuna, deep within the rugged hills of Mexico's Golden Triangle, a region spanning the states of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua. It was a place of sun-scorched soil and poverty, but also the heart of Mexico's illegal drug trade. His father, Emilio Guzmán, was a poor cattle farmer and occasional opium grower. His mother, Maria Consuelo Loera Perez, was known for her toughness and relentless work ethic. And while stories about his father differ, some say he was abusive, others that he was simply indifferent, everyone agrees on one thing. It was his mother who kept the family alive. Joaquín grew up watching her labor from sunrise to sunset, tending animals and feeding 7 children. Years later, even as one of the richest men in Mexico, he would visit her often, returning to the same village where his story began. He built her a large home at the center of La Tuna, a fortress surrounded by poverty, guarded by men with guns. As a child, he was small and quiet. He spoke with a nasal accent and stammered when nervous. School was a luxury his family couldn't afford for long. By the age of 15, he had dropped out to help his father farm. But the land gave little, and the boy's eyes were already fixed on something bigger. Neighbors remember him as clever and restless, always thinking of ways to make money. He sold oranges by the roadside and traded small goods between villages. He'd count fake paper bills he'd made from scraps and ask his mother to save them for him. A child's game that hinted at something deeper, an obsession with money and control. By his late teens, he was working in the fields where poppies grew, the flowers used to make opium. It was dangerous work, controlled by shadowy men with guns. But it was also the only way out of poverty. From there, he began climbing, first as a courier, then as a grower. The young man from La Tuna was learning the business, and the business was drugs. The Golden Triangle was unlike any other region in Mexico. For decades, its valleys had been used to grow illegal crops, from marijuana to opium poppies. The government's reach barely extended into these hills. Here, the real power belonged to traffickers, men who bribed police, paid off soldiers, and ruled villages like kings. By the time Joaquín entered the trade, Mexico's narcotics business had already been reshaped by global demand. The 1970s saw an explosion in drug use in the United States, especially among young people. When the French Connection, the major heroin route from Europe to America, was shut down in 1972, a new opportunity opened for Mexican suppliers. The mountains of Sinaloa, with their isolation and fertile soil, were the perfect place to fill that gap. But it was not without danger. The Mexican government, under U.S. pressure, launched Operation Condor in the mid-1970s, a brutal campaign meant to destroy drug crops and break smuggling networks. Helicopters dropped chemicals over fields. Soldiers raided villages. Innocent farmers were beaten or killed as the army searched for traffickers. Joaquín watched this as a young man. Soldiers would enter his village at night, demanding bribes or dragging people away. It left a mark on him, a lesson that, in Mexico, power didn't come from laws. It came from fear. By his early 20s, El Chapo had left La Tuna for the nearby town of Badiraguato, the birthplace of several future cartel leaders. There, he caught the attention of another Sinaloan trafficker, Hector Luis Palma, a smuggler with connections to the powerful Guadalajara Cartel. Palma took Joaquín under his wing and introduced him to the man who controlled Mexico's drug trade at the time, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. Félix Gallardo was known as El Padrino, the Stout, the Godfather. He had united Mexico's major traffickers under a single network, coordinating shipments for Colombia's Medellin cartel, led by Pablo Escobar. Gallardo's operation moved billions in drugs to the U.S. through carefully planned routes across Mexico's northern border. It was the first true cartel, and it made its members incredibly rich. Joaquín Guzmán started at the bottom, managing airstrips, coordinating convoys, making sure shipments arrived on time. But what set him apart was his obsession with detail. He was a perfectionist, constantly checking his men, double-counting money, planning escape routes. He wasn't the loudest or the most feared, but he was efficient. A man who saw logistics where others saw chaos. By the 1980s, El Chapo had earned a reputation as a reliable operator. the man who could move anything, anywhere, fast. Colombian suppliers began calling him El Rapido, the fast one, because his shipments never missed a deadline. But the cartel world was built on fragile alliances, and by the mid-1980s, that structure began to crack. In 1985, a U.S. DEA agent named Enrique Kiki Camarena was kidnapped, tortured, and killed in Guadalajara. His death sent shockwaves through both Mexico and the United States. American agents poured into the country, determined to find those responsible. Their investigation tore apart Félix Gallardo's network. By the end of the decade, the Guadalajara Cartel was gone, and from its ashes, new empires began to rise. One of them would belong to El Chapo. When Gallardo was arrested in 1989, he summoned his remaining lieutenants and divided his territory. He gave each control over specific regions and routes. Guzmán inherited part of Sinaloa, along with access to key smuggling corridors into Arizona and California. It was the beginning of the Sinaloa cartel, and at its helm was a man no one outside the underworld had ever heard of. At first, El Chapo's operation was small. He ran it from an office in Guadalajara and a warehouse near the border town of Agua Prieta. But what he lacked in size, he made up for with innovation. One of his first ideas was to dig tunnels beneath the US-MX border, something no one had done on that scale before. Under a nondescript warehouse in Agua Prieta, he built a tunnel that stretched hundreds of feet into Douglas, Arizona. It had electricity, ventilation, and hydraulic lifts that hid the entrance beneath a pool table. On one end, packages of cocaine were loaded into carts. On the other, they emerged inside a warehouse north of the border, ready for distribution. Each month, the tunnel moved more than 3 tons of cocaine, worth tens of millions of dollars. The Colombians loved it. No other trafficker could match its efficiency. The success of the tunnels turned El Chapo into a millionaire. He bought mansions, private jets, and exotic animals. He threw lavish parties, surrounded by politicians and celebrities who owed him favors. His henchmen drove cars worth more than most families made in a lifetime. But with power came enemies. By the early 1990s, El Chapo's expansion into new territories brought him into conflict with another powerful family, the Arellano Félix brothers, rulers of the Tijuana cartel. They demanded a tax for every shipment that crossed through their territory. El Chapo refused. Tensions exploded into violence. The war between the Sinaloa and Tijuana cartels would mark the beginning of Mexico's modern drug wars. The first blood was drawn when Ramon Arellano Félix murdered one of El Chapo's allies at a party in 1988. In retaliation, Chapo's men launched a series of hits on Tijuana enforcers. Assassinations, kidnappings, and gunfights became routine. Civilians were often caught in the crossfire. Then, in 1993, came a tragedy that would make El Chapo a household name. At Guadalajara's International Airport, gunmen from both cartels clashed in broad daylight. Dozens of bullets ripped through cars and windows. When the smoke cleared, among the dead was Archbishop Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, one of the most beloved figures in Mexico's Catholic Church. The government's response was swift and merciless. El Chapo was blamed for the killing, whether or not he was directly responsible. His face appeared on every TV screen. His bounty rose to $5 million. For the first time, Mexico's most wanted man wasn't a politician or a rebel. It was a drug lord. In the chaos that followed, El Chapo fled south. He crossed into Guatemala, trying to reach El Salvador, but he never made it. Guatemalan police, tipped off by U.S. intelligence, arrested him and handed him over to Mexican authorities. The man who once controlled billions was now a prisoner facing 20 years for murder, drug trafficking, and corruption. But if anyone thought this was the end of El Chapo Guzmán, they didn't understand the man they were dealing with. For him, prison was not a punishment. It was an opportunity, a new system to infiltrate, a new game to control, and it would not hold him for long. Inside the concrete walls of Puente Grande prison, El Chapo Guzmán was supposed to disappear. Sentenced to 20 years for murder, drug trafficking, and bribery, the Mexican government promised that the country's most infamous criminal would never see freedom again, but those who had crossed paths with him before knew better. El Chapo was not just a trafficker. He was a strategist, a manipulator, a man who saw corruption not as an obstacle but as a tool. Within months of his arrival, the kingpin began to rebuild his empire from inside his cell. He bribed guards, wardens, and even cooks. Money flowed in from the outside like an invisible tide. His prison cell soon resembled a small apartment. Clean clothes, a private television, cell phones, and regular visits from his wives and mistresses. He had food prepared by his personal chef, lobster, steak, and hamburgers delivered fresh to his door. The guards called him Patron, the boss. They smiled when he passed, knowing that a single favor could earn them more than a year's salary. While he lived in relative comfort, his empire on the outside grew stronger. He placed his brother Arturo and his trusted lieutenant, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, in charge of daily operations. Under their guidance, the Sinaloa cartel expanded into new markets: methamphetamine, heroin, and marijuana, building one of the most sophisticated trafficking networks in the world. But El Chapo's life of luxury inside Puente Grande was not to last. In 2001, Mexico's Supreme Court passed a decree allowing the extradition of criminals to the United States. For El Chapo, that was a death sentence. He knew that once in U.S. custody, his empire would be over forever. So he began to plan. On January 19th, 2001, the impossible happened. Guards at Puente Grande realized that El Chapo was missing. The official report said he escaped in a laundry cart, pushed past 8 security checkpoints by a prison guard nicknamed El Chito. Cameras saw nothing. No alarms went off. No one stopped the cart. When the vehicle rolled out of the gate, it carried the most wanted man in Mexico, hidden beneath dirty sheets. Minutes later, a car met him outside the walls. By the time the warden realized what had happened, El Chapo was in the air, flown out of the region by helicopter to safety in the mountains of Sinaloa. The legend had just begun. The escape humiliated the Mexican government and made El Chapo a hero in the eyes of many in Sinaloa. To his supporters, he was a modern Robin Hood, the man who built roads, gave money to farmers, and protected the poor. But to his enemies, he was something else, a ghost. From the safety of the mountains, he rebuilt his operation with a new level of sophistication. He invested heavily in transportation, fleets of trucks, planes, and ships, all modified to hide narcotics. He strengthened alliances with Colombian suppliers and forged new ones in Europe and Asia. His greatest innovation, however, was his network of tunnels. To Chapo, tunnels were the perfect weapon. They were invisible, efficient, and unstoppable. Beneath the border between Mexico and the United States, his engineers built dozens of them, some equipped with lighting, rail systems, and ventilation. They extended for miles, connecting warehouses in Mexico to storage facilities in Arizona, Texas, and California. With these underground highways, El Chapo could move tons of cocaine in hours, faster than any rival cartel. The Americans called him El Rapido, the fast one. But his rise came with blood. The collapse of the Tijuana cartel in the late 1990s had left power vacuums across northern Mexico. Everyone wanted control of the routes, and El Chapo was ready to fight for them. In the early 2000s, a new threat emerged: the Gulf Cartel and its private army, Los Zetas. These men were former Mexican Special Forces soldiers, trained in urban warfare and counterinsurgency. Ruthless and disciplined, they beheaded enemies, displayed corpses from bridges, and filmed executions to spread fear. El Chapo responded with his own militia, Los Negros, led by Edgar Valdez Villarreal, better known as La Barbie. The battle between Los Zetas and Los Negros turned the streets of northern Mexico into war zones. Towns like Nuevo Laredo became killing fields, littered with corpses and burned-out cars. For every victory, there was retaliation. Kidnappings, massacres, and ambushes became daily events. The war cost thousands of lives, most of them civilians, caught between crossfire. When Los Zetas proved too costly to defeat, El Chapo shifted his focus to another battlefield, Ciudad Juarez. The city, just across the border from El Paso, Texas, was a key smuggling corridor worth billions. Control it, and you controlled the gateway to America. For years, Juarez had been run by the Carrillo Fuentes family, the Juarez cartel. They were old allies of Sinaloa, but friendship meant nothing in Chapo's world. When the opportunity came, he took it. In 2004, the fragile peace between the two cartels collapsed. The murder of one of Chapo's brothers ignited a war that would plunge Juarez into chaos. Gunmen roamed the streets with assault rifles and grenade launchers. Entire neighborhoods became battlegrounds. The Mexican government sent in soldiers and federal police, but even they were drawn into the conflict, taking bribes from whichever side paid more. Between 2008 and 2012, more than 10,000 people were killed in the city, the highest murder rate in the world. Chapo directed it all from his mountain hideouts, safe in his strongholds in Sinaloa and Durango. He was always moving, living in simple cabins with plasma TVs, refrigerators, and satellite phones. He'd wake at noon, read messages from his lieutenants, and make decisions that affected continents. He trusted few people, even among his inner circle. His paranoia was legendary. To him, betrayal was inevitable. He armed himself constantly, carrying a gold-plated pistol and an AR-15 at his side. Every house he stayed in had escape tunnels, secret doors, and trapdoors hidden beneath bathtubs. As his empire expanded, so did his list of enemies. The Beltran Leyva brothers, once his closest allies, turned against him in 2008. They accused Chapo of betraying them to the army, a claim that might have been true. What followed was another internal war that set Mexico ablaze. When one of Chapo's sons, Edgar Guzmán López, was murdered in Culiacán during the feud, Chapo retaliated with fury. He reportedly bought every flower in the city for his son's funeral. For days, the air smelled of roses and gunpowder. But even in grief, his mind was calculating. He knew that revenge alone wouldn't save his empire. What he needed was control over communications, over territory, over information. To solve that, he turned to a young Colombian tech expert named Christian Rodriguez. The man was a genius with computers, and Chapo hired him to design an encrypted communication system that couldn't be tapped by authorities. Rodriguez built a private network that allowed Chapo's people to send messages and make calls through the internet using custom phones. Every major trafficker in the Sinaloa cartel was connected. But El Chapo didn't stop there. His paranoia demanded more. He asked Rodriguez to install spyware on every phone in his network, programs that would secretly record calls, track locations, and even turn on microphones remotely. Every conversation, every whisper, every betrayal would be his to hear. For years, this system made him invincible. But like every empire built on fear, it also planted the seeds of his downfall. While Chapo's world descended deeper into chaos, he was becoming a ghost again, untouchable, unseen. He traveled constantly, often on foot through the mountains, guided by loyal farmers who treated him as a saint. To the poor, he was Don Joaquín, the man who brought medicine, built roads, and paid for funerals. To the rich, he was a curse, a reminder of how deeply corruption ran through the country. By 2010, Chapo's network reached across every continent. His cartel controlled 60% of the drugs entering the United States and stretched as far as Europe, Australia, and Asia. His net worth was estimated at over $1 billion. Forbes named him one of the most powerful men in the world. Yet with all his power, he couldn't escape one truth. The walls were closing in. His tech expert, Christian Rodriguez, was being watched by the FBI. The Americans had learned of the secret communication system and wanted access to it. When Rodriguez traveled to New York to meet what he thought were Russian clients, he walked into a trap. The FBI arrested him and offered him a deal: cooperate or disappear. He chose to talk. Through Rodriguez, the FBI gained access to the cartel's network. They could read messages, hear calls, and trace movements in real time. For the first time in history, they were inside El Chapo's empire. It was only a matter of time before they found him. In early 2012, intercepted messages led authorities to a villa in Los Cabos. When Mexican Marines surrounded it, Chapo slipped out through a hidden path in the garden and scaled a wall, vanishing into the night. He escaped barefoot, carrying only his cell phone and a suitcase full of cash. But even for a man like him, time was running out. He was getting older, and his enemies, both inside and outside his cartel, were getting bolder. His second capture was inevitable. For now, though, the legend lived on. In the mountains, in the cities, in the songs sung by narco corridos, El Chapo remained a symbol of defiance, of greed, of power without limits. And yet, every legend ends the same way. Because even the man who built tunnels under nations could not dig his way out of fate. By 2013, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was no longer just a man. He was a myth. The drug lord who could vanish into thin air, the ghost who slipped through every trap, the billionaire who ruled Mexico's underworld from behind curtains of fear and loyalty. But while the world whispered his name with awe and terror, law enforcement on both sides of the border was closing in. Every move he made was being traced, every message intercepted, every secret slowly peeled away. And what finally brought him down wasn't betrayal from his men or a failed deal. It was his obsession with control. The FBI and DEA had been watching Chapo's communications network since his tech specialist, Christian Rodriguez, turned informant. They now had access to the cartel's encrypted phone system, designed to be unbreakable. What they saw inside revealed the daily heartbeat of the Sinaloa cartel. Deals negotiated, shipments tracked, murders ordered. But even with that information, catching Chapo wasn't easy. He rarely stayed in one place. His safe houses were scattered across Sinaloa and Durango, each connected to hidden tunnels that led into sewers or neighboring buildings. When authorities surrounded one home, he'd vanish into the ground and emerge blocks away. In 2012, intelligence traced him to a luxury villa in Los Cabos. The Marines surrounded the property quietly in the night, but inside, El Chapo heard the faint sound of boots on tile. He grabbed a suitcase of cash, climbed through a window, and disappeared through a hole cut into the garden wall. By the time soldiers broke through, he was gone again, barefoot, covered in dirt, laughing as he drove away. For 2 more years, he remained invisible. Then the FBI found a weakness: his love life. El Chapo had always been known for his appetite, for money, for power, for women. He had 4 wives and at least 15 children. But one woman, Emma Coronel, became his obsession. A beauty queen from a small town in Durango. She met him when she was just 17. She was smart, loyal, and completely devoted to him. They married, and she bore him twin daughters. Through intercepted messages, agents discovered that Chapo used Emma and several mistresses to send orders to his men. He trusted them more than anyone else, and that trust would become his undoing. Among his mistresses was a young woman named Agustina Cabanillas, who acted as one of his business intermediaries. She sent coded messages on his behalf, often about drug shipments or safe house logistics. What she didn't know was that her messages were being read by the FBI in real time. Through Agustina, investigators learned that Chapo had left the mountains and moved to the coastal city of Mazatlan. He was staying in a luxury condominium called the Hotel Miramar, under a false name. His wife and young daughters were with him. In the early hours of February 22, 2014, a team of Mexican Marines and U.S. agents surrounded the hotel. As they stormed the building, El Chapo reached for his rifle. But then he heard his wife's voice begging them not to hurt their children. He hesitated, looked at her, and put the gun down. For the first time in 13 years, Joaquín Guzmán was captured. The news spread like wildfire. Television screens across Mexico showed footage of the short, stocky man with a black mustache being paraded before cameras. Soldiers gripped his shoulders as journalists shouted questions. After so many years, the uncatchable king was caught. He was sent back to the same prison he had once escaped from, Altiplano, the country's most secure facility. The Mexican president declared, "It would be unforgivable to let him escape again." Inside, the kingpin seemed calm. He read books, exercised, and even joked with guards. But behind the scenes, his cartel was already building another tunnel. Construction began in early 2014. Using GPS coordinates smuggled to the outside through bribed prison staff, engineers pinpointed the exact location of his cell. Workers purchased land near the prison, a small property with a warehouse. Then they began digging. The tunnel was more than a kilometer long, reinforced with wood beams, equipped with lights, oxygen tanks, and a modified motorcycle mounted on rails. It took them nearly a year and cost millions of dollars. But on the night of July 11th, 2015, everything was ready. At 8:52 p.m., security cameras showed El Chapo pacing inside his cell. He put on his shoes, walked into the shower, and crouched behind a waist-high wall that blocked the camera's view. For a few seconds, he was still. Then, in an instant, he vanished. By the time guards reached the cell, he was gone. Underground, Chapo climbed onto the motorcycle and sped through the tunnel, the air roaring around him. When he reached the exit, his men were waiting with a truck. Within hours, he was back in Sinaloa, free again. The escape was a national humiliation. Mexico's president faced outrage from around the world. How could the most guarded man on earth escape again? Through a hole beneath his shower. For El Chapo, it was his ultimate triumph. Proof that no wall, no cage, no government could contain him. He held meetings with his top lieutenants, plotting the future of the cartel. But this time, things were different. The world had changed, and so had law enforcement. His freedom didn't last long. In 2016, a series of intercepted phone calls led Mexican Marines to a house in Los Mochis, a coastal city in northern Sinaloa. Chapo had been hiding there for days, accompanied by one of his top lieutenants and a small group of bodyguards. At 4:30 a.m., the Marines surrounded the property. As they breached the doors, bullets exploded through the air. Chapo, half-dressed and armed, fled through a secret tunnel hidden beneath the bathtub. He crawled through the sewage system, emerging on a side street. He hijacked a car, then another, and drove toward the highway. But fate finally caught up. A police checkpoint had been set up outside the city. The officers recognized him instantly. There was no more escape, no tunnel, no trick. They dragged him from the car, handcuffed him, and called it in. The ghost had been caught again. This time, the government didn't take chances. Within a year, he was extradited to the United States. On January 19th, 2017, 16 years to the day after his first escape, El Chapo was flown to Long Island, New York, to stand trial. In court, he sat quietly in a dark suit, listening as prosecutors described his empire, the murders, the kidnappings, the billions in profits. Witnesses included his own lieutenants, bodyguards, and even one of his mistresses. They testified about his cruelty, his charm, and his paranoia. One described how he'd once shot a rival dead at a party. Another recalled him laughing as he ordered a man burned alive. But others spoke of his cunning, how he memorized every smuggling route, how he personally approved every major deal, how he could quote drug prices across multiple continents. The evidence was overwhelming. In July 2019, the verdict was announced, guilty on all counts. The charges included drug trafficking, money laundering, murder conspiracy, and possession of military-grade weapons. His sentence, life in prison plus 30 years. El Chapo stood and spoke one last time. He complained about the conditions of his confinement, the isolation, the sleepless nights, the psychological torture. But no one was listening. When he turned to leave, he caught the eye of his wife, Emma, sitting in the gallery. He smiled softly and blew her a kiss. That was the last time they saw each other. Guzmán was sent to ADX Florence in Colorado, the most secure prison in the United States, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. It is a place designed to break the human spirit. Prisoners spend 23 hours a day alone in a 7 by 12-foot concrete cell. The window is 4 inches wide, showing only a slice of sky. El Chapo's new world was silence. No tunnels, no phones, no loyal soldiers. Just white walls, a toilet, and the echo of his own thoughts. He's allowed 1 hour a day in a small enclosed yard, alone. His meals are pushed through a slot in the door. Even his letters are screened by security before delivery. The man who once commanded armies now speaks to no one. Over the years, his lawyers have claimed he's being tortured. They say his water is restricted, his health is failing, his teeth are rotting. He's petitioned the Mexican president to return home to serve his sentence. His request has been ignored. In the end, Joaquín Guzmán's greatest strength, his control, became his curse. Every tunnel, every bribe, every plan was designed to escape confinement. But now, he lives in the one place on earth that cannot be escaped. Outside his cell, his empire still moves. The Sinaloa cartel continues to operate, now led by his sons, Ivan, Alfredo, and Ovidio, the so-called Chapitos. They have inherited not just his roots and his money, but his enemies. The violence continues, the drugs keep flowing, and the myth of El Chapo grows darker with each passing year. In songs, he is still celebrated. In villages across Sinaloa, people still speak of him in the present tense, El Señor, the man who defied governments. But the reality is far less romantic. The man who once commanded billions of dollars now lives in a room smaller than his old bathtub, watched every second of his existence. His story is not one of triumph. It's a mirror, a reflection of greed, power, and the illusion that a man can rise above consequence. For decades, Joaquín Guzmán Loera built tunnels beneath nations, bribed presidents, and silenced armies. He conquered everything, except the one thing no man can escape, the end of his own legend. Because no matter how deep you dig, no matter how many tunnels you build, you cannot outrun the walls that you create yourself. That is the true story of El Chapo, the boy from La Tuna who climbed from dust to a throne of blood, and who, in the end, found himself buried beneath it.